Hi, my name is Etsy Grace, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'm interviewing Brianna R Shaffery about her book Fire and Flight, which is a YA fantasy adventure. So, hi, welcome to the channel,
Hi.
and would you mind telling us a bit about yourself and what it is that you write?
Sure. As Etta said, I am Brianna R Shaffery, and I write YA fantasy. My trilogy is The Heirs of Tenebris, and it follows Nyla, Xander, and Chimera as they try to navigate centuries-old magic, legacies they can't outrun, and try to unravel the hidden history hidden behind the truths and the legends of the Shadow Forest.
That's awesome. Yeah, very epic, very high fantasy, lots of magic, lots of cool settings. So, do you mind telling us what inspired the world of Hair of Tenebris?
Sure. So I've always been a very curious person, and I like kind of poking holes at reality and things that I maybe can't explain or don't know a lot about. So I am that person who's just constantly asking questions, and it could even just be about the simplest thing. And so when I was looking around me as I was writing, I was like, I really don't like the color green. What if the leaves were blue? And so I just started playing around with the world that we live in and how things exist in our world. And I just started tweaking things. And I love history. So I just kind of took a little bit from here and a little bit from there and kind of cobbled it together in like all of my favorite pieces from history and kind of like the aesthetics and the architecture and things of that nature. And I love blending things together. So it was a lot of fun for me to blend kind of like magic principles as we know it, like Wicca and paganism and all that stuff, and blending it together. And how would this interact with science? And how do these two things kind of go together? Do they go together in this world? What system is there? And so it was just kind of me having fun and just kind of letting my mind go wild with things.
That's a really interesting world building process, and I love that you touch on like the science and magic aspect because that's something I like to explore in a lot of my stories too. Our protagonist, Nyla, she starts out kind of reserved. She's scared of her past, and she has magic, but she doesn't really realize that she has magic, or she's afraid of admitting that she has magic. So we learn about the magic along with her, and she grows over the course of the story as she accepts help from the other co-protagonist Xander and embraces her role in the world. So how did you approach her character arc as she finds her purpose and explores her magic?
It was definitely a personal journey because at the time I was drafting, I was actually the same age as Nyla. I was 17. And, I didn't really know what I was doing in life. I don't think anybody ever actually does. So it was started off as a stream of consciousness exercise in my creative expressions class. And all I had was this girl waking up in this strange forest with blue leaves, and she had silver hair and lilac colored eyes. And I just fell in love with it. And so the more I fleshed out Nyla and her journey and just being isolated, the more personal it kind of became to me. I've always been introverted, I've always been very shy. So I played a lot, I guess, just internally with myself and trying to kind of build her up in the ways that I wanted to be. So I'm not saying she is a self insert, but it was a very personal journey. And so watching her grow actually helped me grow. And it was one of those things where when I became conscious of that fact that she was helping me, I was like, I want other people to kind of have that same experience, whether it's with Nyla or with Xander or Shamir. And then in the later books, we have Edwin and Meredith. And I wanted people to have kind of that same experience. So became very conscious, and it like kind of became a weight where I was like, I want her journey to be something that everybody can relate to. I wanted her to show that, yes, just because you have these fears, and yes, just because you have these anxieties, they can empower you. Like, you can use them as fuel in your own life and your own journey. And it became less of a hindrance for her.
I really like how you talk about like growing with your characters because I remember I have characters that I invented in middle school that I've had carried with me for this whole time, and it's a big epic fantasy series. And one day I'll get around to finishing it. One day, um, but I also remember all of the characters that I grew up with reading, like Taryn and Alonmi from the Chronicles of Prydain, or other characters from book
Right.
series that I loved growing up, where it's like I was 15 when I was reading about these characters who were 17, and then I turned 17 and I'm like, oh, I'm the same age as this character, and now I'm in my 20s, and it's looking back on that and remembering how I felt when I first read those books versus
Yeah.
rereading them to my little siblings is such a special experience. Um, I've talked before about how I'm like the oldest of five, so I pass on a lot of the stories that I love to my little siblings, and it's interesting to
Wow.
see them have the same experiences at that young age that I did when I was their age. Um,
Yeah.
so
I'm
that's
the youngest, so I
very
don't
special.
have that. My cousin, she's 4 now, so I'm just like waiting for all of my favorite media where I'm like
Yeah.
a little bit young for this particular one, but we can definitely sit down and watch Kim Possible together.
Yeah.
So,
No.
or like I'm waiting for her to show an interest in like the magic and kind of more of an attention span before turning her on to like Avatar: The Last Airbender, which was my bread and butter growing up. So,
I'm obsessed with Avatar: The Last Airbender. I didn't see it on cable coming out when I was a kid because we didn't have cable, but when it came out on Netflix during the pandemic, I sat down and watched it with all my siblings. And at that point, I'd been like thoroughly spoiled by the internet because I watch all of the like Reddit
I
YouTube videos, and I'm like everybody
yeah,
uses Avatar as the example of good writing because it's like up here. But
yeah,
watching my little siblings who had never been spoiled react to the same things as me, seeing them in context for the first time was a really fun experience.
yeah.
But yeah, that's great how you're talking about like seeing the character grow through the story, and your prose is really like interior too. Like it's very in her head. And so I like that we get to see all of her thoughts and her motivations from a very deep point
Yeah.
of view.
My editors were like, you need to play on this more because you're so good at it. And so was writing a romantasy novel that's coming out in May, and I was just struggling with it. And even with the villains in Fire and Flight, I was like, I can't get in their heads. And so when I got those notes from my editors, I was like, okay, let me just pull out like the worst flaws of myself and see if that comes out in the villains.
We'll get to the villains later in this interview.
Yeah.
We should move on. Xander is our co-protagonist. He's also haunted by his past and a lot of guilt and family trauma, as all great characters are. And when he befriends Nyla and decides to help her in her quest, he finds her like lost in the woods. So, do you mind talking a bit about his arc and how did you balance these two point of views as you wrote? Like, did you have a favorite between them, and how was it approaching these two very different characters?
It was definitely easier for me to write Nyla. Just bare bones, like by the fact that we're both women, it's kind of, I know how like my head works, so it was easier to get into her head. And so my biggest fear with Xander was, is this relatable to somebody who's not me and to somebody who maybe isn't a woman or a girl or, whoever. And so I was terrified of that. And then I just stopped and I told myself, he is a character. At the end of the day, we are all going to have insecurities. We're all going to have something and these strengths and these different things about us and quirks that make us lovable. And so once I reminded myself of that, I was like, okay, this is fine. However I'm writing him is fine.
Mm-hmm.
And I spent a lot of time in the early drafts head hopping. So when I started working with my editors, especially my dev editor, Ashley, who was absolutely amazing. I mean, all of my editors were, but Ashley with the dev edits, I gotta say, she was amazing. And so, because that's pretty much the messiest part of editing. And so she was kind of guiding me like each scene that Xander has needs to kind of give us something about him. So then I had to go through and I had to play with, okay, which scenes give us more insight into Xander and which scenes kind of make sense from him, and basically just which scenes do I like better from his perspective because he has a different observation than Nyla, and something that's maybe a little bit more that builds more on the plot too. And so that's kind of how I balanced them, was who has the insight that the readers need at this moment for the plot, but also who has more heart in this particular scene. And so that was something that I really wanted, especially since, Xander, we don't get a lot from his perspective, but what we do, he has such a good heart. And when we meet him, he's trying to put up a guard, he's trying to put up walls, he's trying to like discover himself and not molding himself to the expectations of others. And that becomes even more prevalent in the sequels, but he has such a good heart. He wants to help people. He has to stick his nose in other people's business and he can't help it. And he's an older brother, so he has that protective nature in him that Nyla, she kind of needs. I hate to say it, but like she does need that because she is completely lost.
Yeah, I love that they complement each other so well, and that his arc mirrors her, and that they're both trying to find themselves in a way,
Yeah.
by taking down their guards and like letting each other in. But yeah, Xander's such an unfailingly kind character, not just to Nyla, but
Really.
also to all of the other like side characters in the story. Like we see him have friends in like several different towns where it's like he stopped
Mm-hmm.
by and they instantly were like, aha, that's my boy, I'm adopting him. Like
Yeah.
the grandparent type figures, and I just thought that was so sweet. And like as we got to know them better, seeing them open up to each other later in the book was very, very satisfying.
I tried so hard to fight them because I call it my strangers to friends to maybe very slow burn. And I tried so hard to fight like playing into like the romantic element of it. I wanted them to have kind of more of like a familiar relationship, but they were just so cute and not like intimate in the sense of like that, but more so just like with each other and just how vulnerable they became with each other. I couldn't stop myself.
Yeah, that's so sweet. Um, Moving on, Tenebris is a world full of magic, different cities, environments, clans, and you mentioned a shadow past. It's very deep in the history. So, can you tell us a bit about how you developed the world building and what's your favorite part of it? I mean, you mentioned the blue leaves, you mentioned some of the
Yeah.
kingdoms, but
Um, all right. So I think my favorite part, which I don't really talk a lot about in the books, is probably the food. I also really enjoyed the myths.
mm-hmm.
So food first. I've noticed a common thing with me is that anytime I think about food, it ends up in a book or story that I'm writing. The most common is pancakes, just in case anybody was wondering. So in the world of Tenebris, we know them as panachkas, and they are one of Nyla's favorite foods. And I don't have a recipe for them, but I make really good pancakes. And that's the only food she can actually make, and that's the only cooking she does throughout the entire series. Everything else is all up to Xander because I also, like Nyla, cannot cook. So um, the myths were just something that I wanted to kind of explain why the forest had sapphire leaves and why the trees were ashen and crackled and looked like embers. And so kind of, again, just let my mind run wild. And it was just so much fun to explain why things in the landscape were the way that they were. And then tying it in with, Nyla's past and then later on with Xander's past. And I just had a lot of fun.
Yeah, there's. I don't want to spoil too much because this is, an interview for people who might not have read the book.
Mhm.
But yeah, there's a lot of their backstories is intertwined with this, ancient
Yes.
war, and I love that a lot of the myths don't have like one right answer. It's like there's a lot of different opinions in the modern day
Yeah.
about like what might have happened. The same way that in like archaeology, it's like
Yeah.
we have no way of knowing like what actually happened at, Troy. Like we can find
Exactly.
Troy, but like how much of this
What happened?
backs up like the Iliad where the gods running around,
Exactly.
Like separating the history from the myths is very difficult, and like there's always fragmented different versions of the myths. And so you have the character saying like, "Oh, such and such told me this and so told me that," but who
Yeah.
really knows the truth?
There's no unified. I might have gotten that from my sister because she actually is an Egyptologist.
That's
And
cool.
so, yeah. So I grew up with her just reading me mythology, and then I was helping her with her dissertation. So I guess it just kind of stuck.
That's awesome. That's awesome that you helped her with her dissertation. And Egyptology is such a cool field. I'm a huge mythology nerd, so that's awesome.
Yeah, it was really fun.
So with the ancient wars and the myths affecting the present day and the characters' backstories tying into that, we get a lot of flashbacks in this book. So how do you keep your timelines in order when you're differentiating a flashback from like the regular narrative of the prose, and how far apart the flashbacks are in time, and all of the timeline
hard.
problems? Yeah.
It was really hard. It was, it's kind of like making soup, is that at first everything is just in the pot. Like you're trying to deconstruct the soup. And it was hard. It was really hard. So I ended up, before I submitted to editors and things of that nature, I did a lot of read throughs, just back to back, reading through, making notes, making notes about revisions that I wanted to make, taking notes about the world building and the timeline, and trying to figure out how many days it took them to get to Fortune Falls, and if they were going to make it, did they not, and just all these different things of, are they going to drink? Are they not going to drink from the falls? What are they going to do? And what are they going to get from the falls if they get there? And so it was just stuff like that. And it was just a lot of handwriting and a lot of handwritten notes and a lot of, what did I write here? And when I went back to go and type it, so I ended up finally getting everything organized in a note document. And I made a little timeline for myself. And after that, I was like, okay, I'm going to put things where they need to be so that it flows logically and that it's easy to read, and then I'm not touching it again.
Very smart, very smart.
I'm like, I'm not adding anything. I'm not subtracting anything. I'm going to leave it be and flesh things out that need to be fleshed out and let other people infer what needs to kind of be either foreshadowing or that is a cool fact for me, but it's not necessary to the narrative.
Many such moments like that where I've covered the wall
Yes.
behind me in sticky notes before.
Yes.
Making like a conspiracy board. So yeah, very familiar with that process.
Yep. It's like just spread out everywhere. I took up the entire hallway floor, and that's when I realized I'm never doing this again. I'm going to be organized. And yeah, I continue to be a pantser.
I love the differences between planners and pantsers in the writing community and how we all get to an end product eventually, but we have such different paths.
I know. I love it. It's chaotic, but it's like the best kind of chaos.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the villains before, so I wanted to ask about our red-eyed villain in this story who pursues Nyla despite some of his own misgivings about the whole situation. Mm-hmm. So what can you tell us about this powerful sorcerer and why he has such personal problems with this teenager?
First off, I love how you phrased this question because it really made me sit here for a second like, yeah, why does he? Even though I know why. It was just like so perfect. So Cedric is, I don't know if you're familiar with Wicked. If you've seen the movie, it's kind of a big thing.
Mm-hmm. I've not seen the movie yet, but I'm familiar with like the stage play.
Okay, cool. I call him my beautifully tragic character because he is somebody who has spent 647 years bitterly regretting his life choices. And so instead of letting go of the past, very much so like the protagonist, he is stuck in the past. He is haunted by the past. And what I love about him, and it's hard for, like, the more I wrote him, because I wanted him to be this big, scary villain. Like, I had him throwing things at walls. I had him being absolutely awful to the other people around him. And then finally, it didn't stick. Either, like, I'm just not that kind of writer where I can't be mean and have mean characters. But it just, for him, for whatever reason, it just didn't stick. Like, he couldn't be that villain. And so I stripped everything away from him. I took away the attendance that I had surrounding him. I just isolated him because there was just something about isolating characters in this novel that I absolutely enjoyed. And it just stripped him down to like his core, and getting to play with that and trying to figure out what part did he play in the war that happened 647 years ago? What legends does he know that he can kind of confirm either for the reader, for me, or anybody? And then just trying to figure out what is his connection to Nyla? Why is he going after her? Is he going after her? What is he doing to her? And the more I developed him, the more sorry I felt for him. And it was hard to bring any kind of reckoning toward him, but I think it all paid off in the end. And then it was kind of like I decided to play into the fact that he is a tragic person, and that, there are really bad people but then there are also people who have done bad things that maybe aren't necessarily bad people. And I really wanted to play with that. And I had a lot of fun. Like, I know I've said that a lot, but I had a lot of fun exploring just the different moralities and like the different shades of it and playing with that scale. And even in like the religions, which they're not really big in the trilogy, but there are different religions. So getting to play with their histories and like how they view morality, because I really didn't want to fall into this good versus evil. I wanted there to be a lot of gray. And because that's just how life is. There is a lot of gray. And I just kind of wanted to play with that. And it was a lot of fun.
I love that since he's such a regretful character,
Mm-hmm.
that he doesn't like what he's done, but he's continuing to do it. Like it's like he's bought into the
Yes.
sunk cost fallacy. Of he's like, well,
Yes.
I've
Yes.
done all of these things. I'm too far in to turn back. I need to see this through to the end, even though I don't.
Mm-hmm.
I've realized I don't like what I'm doing anymore, and that's such an
Right.
interesting dynamic to read in contrast with Nyla's like strong resolve in what it is that she's doing. Once she finds that resolve, she's
Exactly.
very there.
Yeah.
And the parallels of isolation too. That Nyla starts as this isolated character and finds a community in Xander and Xander's connections and Shamira and these other characters who surround her. And this character starts isolated and remains isolated, and it just
Mm-hmm.
gets worse for him. Um,
Yeah.
and the comparisons between them as they diverge on these trajectories, their
Mm-hmm.
character arcs. Very well done.
Thank you.
So, this is the first book in a self-published series. It's a trilogy. So, what brought you to self-publishing? What was the most challenging part, and what was your favorite part about self-publishing?
So I started querying about a year after I graduated high school. And I felt like I was ready. I was totally going to do this. And like while I was querying, I only sent out a couple because I had been spending that whole year kind of researching the different publishing paths and signing up for different courses and resources and things of that nature and conferences just to kind of get a feel for like what my options were. And there was this really great conference and webinar that I think it was a Writer's Digest one hosted by Michael Laurent. And he just totally laid out everything you needed to know about self-publishing and the pitfalls. He laid out the pitfalls of traditional publishing, hybrid publishing, what to watch out for, vanity presses and things like that. And after doing his webinar and like searching through it and taking notes and like just kind of doing some other research on the side just to make sure that like he wasn't cheerleading for self-publishing, because everybody needs to kind of do their due diligence and pick the best path for themselves. I just remember looking at my parents like, I think I'm going to self-publish. Like, I am ready. Fire and Flame is ready. I don't want to wait years or decades trying to get this book published because I'm ready to do it now. And I don't want to spend so much time waiting for it and then have this energy that I have for it now pass. And so that's ultimately what led me into it. And then I got connected with this company who provides self-publishing services, which is how I met my editors, because that was like the biggest thing I was concerned about, was being scammed by people who didn't have the credentials to edit a novel and to do it well.
Mm-hmm.
So they connected me with fantastic editors. I absolutely loved working with Ashley, Kate, and May. And so they're still editing my books to this day. I'm like, you guys are stuck with me. Like, until you tell me that there is a subject matter that you're just not into, you're stuck with me. And they're fine with that. Thank
That's
goodness.
great. I'm so glad that you have a good relationship with your editors. That's really
Me
important to
too.
have.
Me too. I was so worried about that. So that was definitely the scariest thing, finding my editors. And I was nervous about finding a cover designer, but my mom works in marketing. So she has graphic design connections, and she recommended me to somebody who is actually my brother-in-law's cousin. So I was like, this is perfect. And we've gotten along great. So Marcella has actually done a lot of the artwork that we see. She's done all of my covers for the trilogy. She's done anything that isn't people for the artwork. And then she recommended me to a friend Del Hart family portrait, Nyla's family, and I used an artist that I've always admired. I don't know her real name, unfortunately, but Tadpole Art on Instagram. She did the deities for me, so that was a lot of fun. I think watching other people take like my paragraphs and paragraphs of description that I give them and just providing beautiful artwork and bringing the world to life is probably my favorite part. That or interacting with readers, because I do some book signings too throughout the year. That's always a lot of fun.
That's awesome. And I'm glad that you spoke to the power of connections because I think as an indie author, that's one of the most important things that we can
Yeah,
have. Like that's why I do these
definitely.
interviews. That's why you do arcs for other people. My book's not out yet. It's going to be coming out in a year, but I have been doing this for 4 years now, like trying to make connections and put myself out on the internet and like run a blog and run a YouTube channel and be on Instagram and like have a presence so that way I can connect with people. And it's been
Right,
so fruitful. It's been so wonderful. I've read so many good books. I've met so many cool authors. And I can only hope that like when my time comes to publish, like people are willing to pay it forward a little bit. But really,
right,
indie authors need to support each other and lift each other up. And the community that I found is so wholesome and so good at that. And that's how you find, your good editors. That's how I found my editors. That's how I'm hoping to find, artists and things like that. So I'm really glad that you spoke to the power of connections because it's intimidating to put yourself out there and like start marketing
exactly.
yourself if you're a new writer and you're like, oh my god, where do I start on the internet? I don't want people looking at me.
I'm still kind of in that phase, so
Yeah,
it's
but
always hard.
it's hard. It's so hard to put yourself out there like that. But you find so many kind people, and it's
Exactly.
been one of the most worthwhile things I've done. It's so satisfying. So I'm glad you spoke to the power of the connections, and I'm glad that you were able to find such great editors that you like and still work with,
Me
and
too.
artists that you like and still work with who you're related to or you have connections to. Like that's so
Yeah,
convenient. That's so great.
it definitely took a lot of the worry out of it.
Now, you mentioned that you have art for these stories. That's on your website. My last question for you is a freebie. If there's anything I haven't mentioned yet that you'd like to talk about now, whether that's the art or something else, feel free to ramble.
Yeah, okay. Oh, I've done a lot of rambling, um, or at least I feel like I have. Okay,
No,
let's
go
see.
ahead. Go ahead.
There is a companion guide which dives deeper into just the world building, the mythology, the history, anything that is mentioned in the trilogy. So it's free to my newsletter subscribers. So if you want to head over to brswrites.com/newsletter, you can sign up for it there and you'll get the companion guide. There's a short story that's kind of like a tie-in novel, but it's like a completely separate novella based on one of the animals of Tenebris, the Cerbertes, which we talk a little bit about in Fire and Flight, but not like a whole lot. And it plays into Xander's past. The novella, I should say, is set in an entirely separate timeline than what the main trilogy talks about. Um, so it just explains more of the myth of the Cerbertes and why they're called a hellhound. Um, so that was a lot of fun. It's more of like a gothic horror novel a little bit, and it has that vibe. And that was again one of those times where I was like, guys, I have no idea what I'm writing. I have no idea what I'm doing. I just read all of these different gothic horror novels, and they're like, you're fine. Just focus on what you're good at, and you will be fine. Like you've got this. You're fine. So this is why I appreciate my editors because they're just here like every time I have kind of imposter syndrome, I'm like, I need help. I'm trying to think anything else. All of the artwork is on my website, my Instagram, and I have different blogs that break it down too. If you do not want to sign up for my monthly newsletter, it just goes into more detail in the companion guide. I think that's it. I think we hit everything. As kind of we've been talking about a little bit, it is a trilogy with Fire and Flight being the first. And, as trilogies usually do, each book builds on each other. And personally, Embers of Eternity is my favorite. I feel like that's kind of where the happily ever after is a little bit. And it's like Nyla and Xander, I feel like at their happiest. And then Winds of War comes along and kind of takes that all away for a little bit.
Oh no, these poor children.
I promise it has a happy ever after. It may not be the one everybody expects. It may not be the one that they expected or wanted or dreamed of. But, you know, I grew up on a steady diet of Disney stories and happily ever afters. And, you know, there's just so much that doesn't end happily that when I'm writing, I want a happy ending. Like, I don't care what they go through to get to that happy ending. I just want them to have a happily ever after, whether it's the one they thought, whether it's the one that they wanted, they dreamed of, they thought they deserved. I at least want to see them happy at the end of the book. So even though Winds of War has a lot going on, it does end happily.
That's great. I know I'm far more likely to pick up a story if it has a happy ending. And I like my occasional tragedy. I just watched Arcane. I love my occasional tragedies. But happy endings are very special to me too. And I'm more likely to pick up a trilogy if I know that it's going to have a satisfying happy ending where all the character arcs get wrapped up like that. So that's great. So my last question is just where can we find you and your work online? You mentioned your website. What else do you have coming up?
Yeah, so I'm actually diving into romantasy. So it's part of a collaboration that I'm working on with a few different other indie authors. So each one of us are writing a standalone with the common theme, and it happens to be thieves. So I'm very excited to it's actually finished. I have to do one final pass before ordering my format proof. So it was hard because I'm not typically a romance person. The biggest joke throughout my entire writing career is that I can't write romance. So trying to write that while my editors and I were all kind of co-writing together in a little group and all working on our own novels. So each time we would come back from writing on our Zoom calls, they would all look at me like, so how's the romance going? And I would always just sit there like, well, somebody got stabbed. And they would just sit there and look at me like, but they're romance.
I'm sorry, that's so funny.
I promise there is romance. There actually did, kisses happened and romance things happened. But yeah, somebody got stabbed.
That's absolutely fantastic. I love that.
Thank you. It was definitely an exercise in writing for me.
I'm not really much of a romance writer either. Like, I'll read it occasionally if I'm doing like an ARC review and it's a friend that I know who writes romance and things like that. It's not my usual genre. It's not my favorite genre. It's good. I like it.
It's my guilty pleasure genre, if I'm being honest.
I know romantasy is like the hugest thing on the market right now. I thrive off of like family focused stories. All of my characters are like sibling pairs, like almost inevitably. So it's not always my thing, but I feel like if I had tried to write a romance, like it would probably end the same way. I did try to write a romance. It was like an already married couple, but they were separated and had to they're separated by space and had to like try and find each other again. And it's like a historical fiction story for an anthology that I'm writing. And like I kept having to remind myself to put back in the romance. So like somebody got stuck in an explosion because it's the 1800s and safe working practices aren't a thing.
I feel that. That's that's exactly how writing this next novel went for me.
But it's good to stretch outside of your comfort zone too. And I'm glad that you're having fun with it, and I'm very excited to see where it goes and where this whole collection goes. Like you said, that you're writing with a bunch of people. So that's very exciting, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me tonight about Fire and Flight. I'll be sure to link your website and everything else in the description of this video, and there'll also be a transcript going up with this. So
awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me and for taking the time to read Fire and Flight. It's like you were saying before, having connections and just I'm not gonna lie, finding a community was just it was like the most humbling thing for me and also the most exciting thing for me. And I'm just so glad to have found, especially on Tumblr and a little bit on Instagram and just kind of making a home for myself there. It was really nice.
Yeah. I'm very glad that you found that, and I'm very glad that you could make it onto the channel tonight. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this and for giving me a copy of Fire and Flight. I really enjoyed it. And thank you all for watching.
Thank you.